Welcome to the highly mediated media version of this year's area program in Literary Prose final reading and send-off. I'm Elizabeth Denton, the director of the program, and it's been my remarkable good fortune to work with a spectacularly talented and spectacularly hardworking group of students this year. The odds were against them coming in. COVID kept many cooped up and confined to quarters, day after day after day. They didn't see friends, sometimes couldn't see family, were denied the stimulation of in-person workshops and conferences. Yet they struggled forward. They turned their sad isolation into productive solitude. They found ways to connect with and support one another against the odds. They made a community where there looked to be nothing but separation. They did their work and they did it brilliantly. Listen and look, and you'll see. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Grace. I'll be reading from my thesis, Pictures of My House on Fire. Picture of the nighttime room. My bedroom is perfectly square and almost completely covered. Dense carpet, painted walls, thick curtains, and even thicker comforter, robed mirror, heavy bookcase. Shadows obscure the spines of books, dark wood teasing at night even during the day, inky secrets waiting to spill. Castles made of night and shadow. The carpet is lush, overgrown like the hair down my back that I only occasionally slice off with the kitchen scissors. I peek at the dressed mirror, pulling the fabric that covers it aside slowly and letting it fall back quickly so that I only see myself in slivers. The orb of my eye glancing back at me, the moon in the night of the darkness behind me. Freckles star my cheeks, lips bitten at so often they look bloodied. Scraps of hair moving like curtains to hide my face. Strange, half-formed pictures as if I am imagining myself, making her up, and sometimes forget pieces or exchange them with bits and bobs from other people. Tilted smile of the girl in my dreams, rounded nose of our dog, moonlit eyes of my mother. It was a sticky night when my mother climbed into bed with me, a child's bed not meant for two, so we were close and breathing each other's breath. Did you have a nightmare? My question whispered as if the night had ears and we had secrets from it. Darling, my mother whispered back, don't ever love a man if you can help it. It's the coldest thing in the world. Her eyes glowed like moons, and she told me a bedtime story about love. Once there was a girl in an old, old house that was said to be haunted by the ghosts of unhappy lovers who trailed the house staining blood on the ground behind them, but was really haunted by the girl's two hard and cruel parents that kept the girl away from even the possibility of love. His eye drifted in and out, and he appeared through the window as though the girl had dreamt him up, and she thought he was there to take her away with him, only that wasn't what he really wanted. Dreaming of cold men who wore my father's face, and my parents hard and stiff as walls, and a young girl feeling trapped. My mother and my warm bodies radiated under the bedsheet, and I felt safe with her there, exchanging her bedtime story for one of mine that I thought might comfort her. Outside, the world flooded into rain, pouring open, saturating the earth so that it heaved and breathed, wet gasping, muddy slurping. I heard the rush and felt the woven fabric of everything unravel. My mother inhaled a muted gasp, took in the watery air, and rivered into some other material. Underwater, it is easier to imagine the world just washing away, and nothing is as solid as it seemed before. Moonlight filters through the windows of my bedroom and covers me with wide, flat palms as I lay amongst the carpet, remembering that night. The stippled ceiling becomes the night sky, inking over and bursting into stars. I see faces. The carpet grows long and fibrous, sharpening to the tips of grass blades as I slide my hands through them. I feel the squish of fertile soil when I press my fingers down, feeling it give under the slight pressure as my hands find their way through the earth, down through the dirt. The air crystallizes, musty heaviness growing still and solid and shattering into a humidity ripe with fruity darkness. I can smell the sweet undertones of dirt too well fertilized, and pinches of salt from tears the ground has cried. My fingers greet other fingers, roots and dead bodies, all the same veiny tendrils underground. Their hands hold me, and they are warm, human, grasping together, pleading fingers forming the joined hands of prayer. My mother hasn't forgiven me for what I told her that night. She pulled back as if I was a stranger, looking at me like some kind of mistake, and the next day sent me to the old, old house haunted by the hard and cruel parents where girls get trapped. If I hadn't said anything, we could still be warm and keeping each other safe from nightmares. People are right in thinking why I keep my mouth shut. It's the devil inside. But I still feel her near in the house, almost as if her body is warm right next to mine. The walls around me thicken with the blood of mothering, and it stains my skin all over. Tears water the ground, full of dead things that hold me tight.
Hi, my name is Anouck Dussaud, and I will be reading an excerpt from my thesis, A Good Death. Once the Nembutal was ordered and delivered and the death date set, Colleen entered a period of indiscriminate happiness such as Jane had never seen before. Her joy was so expansive it was almost irritating. Her appetite returned, and then some. She heaped her plate and praised Jane for her cooking that was undeniably bland. Jane began to wonder if this meant her mother wouldn't go through with it after all. Maybe all she needed was the awareness that she could if she wanted to. But how could she want to when there was so much she still seemed to enjoy? She asked for bowls of chocolate ice cream. She demanded to be helped outside at midnight to look at the stars. She made a joke about never having seen so many stars before, on account of her double vision. She even took an interest in politics, something she hadn't bothered with in years and years. She listened to the news channels with her eyes closed and talked to Jane about congressional appointments and gerrymandering. It didn't last. Jane could pinpoint the exact moment her mother's happiness collapsed, the night of her final bath. The bathroom was wood-paneled with a sloping triangular ceiling. You had to watch your head when reaching for the towel rack. The recessed light above the tub was black at its center where dead flies and ladybugs had collected. For someone who talked a lot about bodies, sex, toilet humor, errant hairs, and itchy yeast infections, Colleen wasn't a naked person. There were very few times that Jane could remember seeing her mother without clothes. Once, when she was 10, her mother enlisted her help retrieving a tick in a hard-to-reach place. "It's times like these I wish I was married," Colleen had said, as Jane ventured forth with the tweezers. At 90, Colleen's body was stooped, small, and round as a pear in the middle, in the way that women seem to swell from their abdomen with age. Her skin was all veins, networks of burst blood vessels, and brown age spots. Jane noticed that she had almost no body hair left, and even her mons pubis was bare, like a baby's. Jane helped Colleen into the tub and knelt at her feet to guide her legs over the rim. Colleen's hand rested on her bent back for support. She smelled old. Jane knew her mother liked to get baths over with as quickly as possible, but she still tried her best to make them worthwhile. Jane wet her mother's hair with a detached shower head, holding it close against her so as not to get water in her eyes. She massaged the shampoo into her scalp, feeling the shape of her skull, the strange indent on the right side. Jane scratched at the base of her mother's neck, a sleepy-making trick she had learned from Colleen herself. She wanted to impart what she could not say, or could not say enough, with her fingers and the palm of her hand, sweeping back the wet hair from her mother's blue temples. "I love you, I love you." She turned away as Colleen washed between her legs. Jane helped her out of the tub by placing a hand under each armpit. Her mother looked straight ahead, concentrating hard as she stepped over the rim. She must have landed funny because she tipped forward, sending Jane staggering back. Her naked body sagged into Jane, her wet chest soaked through Jane's t-shirt, her open mouth leaned against Jane's shoulder. They stood like this in a puddle of bath water, Colleen saying over and over again, "It's enough now." Toweled and dressed for bed, she let Jane clean the residual shampoo from her ears with a Q-tip. When Jane had told friends and acquaintances about her mother's impending death, which she did often and compulsively, they usually asked if she was terminally ill. This question was arbitrary to Jane, even irritating, because every life had its terminus. No, she was just old, irreversibly old, Jane said, laughing gaily, which seemed to leave them unsettled. She recognized in herself her mother's impulse to shock and discomfit others. Normally, this would have disturbed her, but now it satisfied her. Colleen was a very old woman, she had explained, 90 years old, almost an entire century. 90 years old and living in a too-big house with impossibly high ceilings. That tiny woman under cathedral ceilings. Her legs were always swollen, the skin of her ankles stretched in red bands, filled with fluid and hot to the touch. The discs in her back were always slipping out of place. Even sitting up was painful. Horizontal day after horizontal day, incontinent. She had to be lifted by the armpits from chair to chair by strange caretakers with accents. The final straw was her eyesight, which had begun doubling. With one pair of eyes, she saw two of everything. 2 TV screens, 2 mountains where there was one, 4 feet on the footstool. Hired help bathed her and wiped her, and nothing inside her was left private, and her body was not her own. What was more terminal than old age?
Hi, my name is Mary Katherine Guthrie, and my thesis is about my experience on semester at sea in spring 2020. This section is called The Great Pacific Garbage Patch. I sat in the same seat for global studies every day, no matter the lecturer. The union was massive, filled with rows of red velvet armchairs and ornate marble end tables. Along the walls and windows were 10 or so matching red velvet sofas, somewhere between chaise lounge and fainting couch. Dozens of foldable half-desk, half-chair contraptions littered the walkway. There was even a balcony level, which could be reached by a velvet-lined staircase of impressive size. Emily, Dalton, and I squeezed into the second closest couch to the stage on the starboard side of the main level every morning while at sea. I spent most lectures staring out of the window at the waves. Scott Denning was the least painful of the 3 global studies professors. He was the scientist, leading lectures about the ocean we called home, global fishing and sustainability practices, navigation by astronomy, and natural occurrences of interest in our port countries like the Mekong Delta and Ha Long Bay in Vietnam. He even led a few stargazing nights on our long stretches at sea. I got to see the Southern Cross from the pool deck one night in the Indian Ocean. The captain turned off all of the ship's external lights except for the emergency beacon. A few hundred of us piled into the open space at the bow of Deck 9, laying like tightly packed sardines as Scott Denning waved a laser pointer around the night sky, his voice drowned out by the crashing waves. I had the least trouble attending global studies when Scott was scheduled to teach. The class was so early, 08:30 on both A days and B days. Global studies was actually the only class we had to attend every single day we spent at sea. The rest were split, meeting only on alternating days, since so few classroom spaces were available. In fact, except for the infamous poetry writing workshop in the ad lawn, all of my other classes also met in the union, in one of 6 sectioned-off areas made into makeshift classrooms after global studies. The union somehow funneled the dull rocking of the ocean in just the right way to send me to sleep, especially so early in the morning. I would have never gone to global studies if Michael Manny hadn't collected participation note cards to prove our attendance. The class's topic was fascinating in theory, but the execution was poor under head Professor Manny, who we usually referred to as Professor Manatee or Mayonnaise. He was a SAS veteran, having sailed as a student and a professor before. On his last voyage, about a decade ago, he had an affair with the librarian. He then divorced his wife, married the librarian, and moved to Singapore with her. He gave me the creeps. His lectures were the least sensical. He often rambled on about McMansions and the ratcheting down of the minimally acceptable. I honestly couldn't tell you what any of it meant. The third professor, Sue, was a spectacular example of a bad parent on display before our very eyes. Her husband and kids accompanied her on the voyage, including her oldest daughter, Cassette. She was around 13 or 14 and extremely sure of herself, without a doubt the most confident kid I'd ever met. She got a custom-tailored suit in Vietnam and shaved her own head in the Indian Ocean. Cassette was by far the most universally loved ship kid and spent more of her time around the college students than her own family. Sue would constantly call Cassette strange in her lecture anecdotes, telling the entire shipboard community very personal stories about her young daughter's life. Cassette made it clear to anyone who asked that she never agreed to these stories being told publicly. Sue's lectures were supposed to be about globalization, learning patterns, and cultural differences, I think. Despite Professor Mayonnaise's attendance policy, class was always sparsely attended on Sue's days. About halfway between leaving Mexico and arriving in Hawaii, Scott Denning was slated to give a lecture about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch on a particularly rough day at sea. The Union's enormous windows were just high enough above sea level to avoid the salt spray that often covered our cabin porthole, but on this day, I watched from our usual Union couch as the ship's bow crested a 30-foot swell and hovered in the air for a moment before crashing down. Notebooks and laptops flew into the air. The Union's crystal chandelier swung violently overhead. 2 people vomited. We sailed through it, the garbage patch, that day and many days to follow, although we'd never have noticed, especially with those waves. But all below and around us floated billions of microplastics covering an area twice the size of Texas. Debris discarded from North America and East Asia converges in one area following ocean currents, bumping into other garbage and being systematically crushed into microscopic pollutants. The water still looked to be the same deep black blue that I'd seen every day since embarkation. After Scott's lecture, Emily, Dalton, and I split to go about our days. The Union was the center of the ship, both symbolically and literally. It was on the same deck as Berlin, with only the library and some bathrooms between them, though somehow none of the other spaces on Deck 6 suffered the watery turbulence that plagued the Union that day. Dalton headed up the stairs to his student assistant shift in the Dean of Students' office on Deck 8, while Emily went to the library, where she had reserved internet time. The library was constantly packed, as it was the only space on the ship with desktop computers that were always online. Every voyager was allowed only 30 minutes of internet access a day total, split between however many personal devices they chose. The rest of the bandwidth was reserved for the ship's navigational tools, unless you were willing to drop hundreds of dollars on an internet package. Only a handful of lifelong learners, faculty spouses, and Kristen from New Jersey bought in. The rest of us signed up for desktop slots or slipped out of global studies a few minutes early to sneak onto a computer. Despite the waves, it was already a sunny morning, so I decided to do my Literature of the Earth reading outside. Deck 6 did not have much outdoor space aside from the ping-pong tables and lifeboat stations, but up a short flight of stairs and past the designated smoking area was my favorite study spot on Deck 7 aft. It was the least populated of the outer decks because most of the space was taken up by the Fitzroy Faculty Bar, one of the few areas on the ship where the adults could retreat away from us students. There were a handful of tanning chairs and 3 tables available for student use, and one of those tables was always in the shade, no matter the time of day. Emily found the spot first, just wandering around on one of the earliest days at sea trying to get her bearings. I liked to work there because I could listen to the waves, but I didn't need to put on sunscreen. I was out for a few hours that day, reading and annotating and taking frequent breaks to stare wistfully into the vast expanse of the ocean. I never saw any garbage. I did see a few flying fish, which wasn't uncommon in the Pacific. I wondered if they saw the garbage. I wondered if they knew what it was doing to them or what it even was. I wondered how much of it I may have put there. Thank you.
Hi everyone, it's Madison, and this is my reading from my thesis. So just for reference, this part of my thesis takes place in 363 CE, and it is about 2 girls, Cassia and Vita. It's from Cassia's perspective, who live in Petra. And this was the year when Petra was hit by a really violent earthquake and much of the city was destroyed. So I wrote it from their perspective of walking down a mountain after leaving the baths and the spa and having this earthquake hit. So yeah, let's get started. As we walk back to the town, at the particular point where we pass the farms which dot the sides of the mountain, there is a violent shaking of the earth. I find myself thrown to all fours, curled up in a tight ball. My hands sting from the impact, and I can feel that dust and sand have lodged themselves in the scrapes which no doubt run along my palms. I watch in horror as the city I had previously been admiring sways in front of me. A fear pierces through me that the ground beneath my feet, which is perpetually cracked, will open up and swallow me whole. Thankfully, within a few very long moments, the shaking subsides. I turn my attention to the church closest to me, the one with a circular dome and pillar in its center. Cracks begin to spiderweb their way through the columns holding up the dome, and it crumbles with a quiet violence before my eyes. I see other buildings in the distance crumbling as well. I look to my right where I see Vita has been thrown on her side. She appears to be unharmed. For that, I send up a small prayer of thanks. We make our way to our feet and hold on to one another as we continue to descend the mountain to our city, which now, although it looks as though the sun has barely moved any further down the horizon, is in ruins. When we attempt to continue down into the valley, The shaking begins anew, but this time with more force. There is a stumble, and then a fall, and then a snapping, and then a loss, and I know that we are alone. I know that no one will find us. I know that when I say no one will find us, I do not simply mean in the aftermath of our fall, but in whatever eternity is on this earth. I do not know, as we tumble downwards and find that although the sand may look as though it will cushion our fall, it is but an illusion of safety, a counterfeit comfort meant to quell the roaring in our minds before it tears out of our throats. Had the sand not been there, not convinced us for that split second that we could survive, we may have omitted some sort of noise. This noise may have caught the attention of some other animal. This other animal may have sought out the commotion. This other animal would have been too late to save us, but we would have been remembered. This other animal could have brought more animals, perhaps even my family, who I did not know at the time were also dead, who could have paid some sort of respect in form of whispered prayer or burning pyre. But there was no noise from our throats. The only sounds were the reverberation of cracking bone on sizzling rock, wine sloshing within our stomachs, the rushing of air from our mouths as we rolled, the dislodging of countless tiny rocks, and the subsequent whisking away of those rocks in the wind along with our last breaths. These sounds were swallowed by the land around us, woven into the cacophony of silence which is not silent at all. Later, after we have left our own bodies, there are needlepoint legs of smaller animals crawling along our exposed skeletons. There is a symphony of inaudible taps and buzzing. There is the rip of gravity pulling a slab of skin from our bellies to the surface of the earth. There are two pairs of eyes that remain open, staring at the stars and understanding what they mean, understanding why they hide. This understanding did not occur within our rotting bodies, but outside of them, in the space in between which we now occupy. There is the bleaching of bone and the gradual decomposition which makes sand of us all. The whole time, the wind howls, caressing our bodies and blowing bits and pieces of us to places both near and far. The wind gives us a blanket, laying layer upon layer of sand upon us until the parts of us which could not be blown away are sheltered from the wind itself. The wind and sand, which had stolen our ability to bleed or roar, gave us the gift of protection. We are burned to ashes by the sun and buried by the world. Footsteps of other animals, which could not have found us before, tread above our blanket, which transformed to rock over time. By some small miracle, although we know that there is always intention and never luck, those who later dug up the world around us never thought to dig up the spot where we found rest. Hands never caressed our bones or brushed away our blanket in a vain attempt to understand the past. To be remembered is to be understood. It is also to be violated. We crave no understanding, no invasion, for our only mistake was falling, and we are together. Thank you. Yeah, that's it.
Annie Parnell, and the title of my thesis is It Makes Instead a Great Curve. 18 of the 250 paintings in Claude Monet's Water Lilies series depict a small Japanese footbridge over a pond in his garden. The bridge, a gentle backyard slope, is a minute focal point in comparison to the scope of Monet's depictions of railway bridges and the Waterloo and Charing Cross bridges in London, but perhaps it is this that makes it such a compelling motif. A bridge, Monet suggests, does not need to be the urgent backbone upon which an entire region rests in order to be worthy of study. It must only go somewhere, even if the water it crosses can be circled with ease. The Water Lilies series was the main creative focus of the last years of Monet's life. In addition to the bridge and its garden, they depict his grief after the death of his second wife and the slow onset of cataracts that almost blinded him. The bridge waxes and wanes. In some of the oil paintings, it is a bright arch bathed in lush colors and finely detailed with shadows and light, while others depict it blending into the garden so that it is nearly indistinguishable from the pond. The cataracts came in 1912, a year after Alice's death. Straining through his blurring vision and his own melancholy, Monet, in this period, paints the bridge as a dark smudge across the garden landscape. The bridge, from a distance. From this angle, it is a white blur against the water, barely distinguishable from the horizon line. The afternoon before this one, we threatened to dip our toes into the water. You pointed out the ducks in the bay by saying ducks, and I said ducks back to you. The ducks, of course, said nothing. We had not left the house in days, and the harsh rot of the sun made us squint. When I leaned back against the scabby wood of the dock and gazed upward, a set of cirrus clouds drifted open in the sky like a rib cage. What does the fear of bridges, Japhyrophobia, do to the body crossing them? A friend of mine, terrified of public speaking, can't eat for days before giving a presentation or making a speech. Does a bridge fear mimic this? An anxious build that begins shortly before the Annapolis exit and climaxes at the trusses at the halfway mark, the most outward point on the great curve of the bridge? Or does it behave like a fear of heights, gripping the body only when the brain understands how high up it truly is, how exposed a car is on the bridge, how open and endless the sea below? The brain, instead of releasing more and more stress hormones as the bridge looms, might deposit them all at once, the moment the full scope of the bridge is understood, potentially splaying out the apex of the fear over the entire 20 minutes that it typically takes to cross. Japhyrophobia can be a symptom of an underlying anxiety disorder, a response to a previous negative experience with a bridge, or part of a larger constellation of fears connected to death, a lack of control, or being trapped. It can develop randomly. A regular user of the services provided by Kent Island Express once had a sudden debilitating panic attack strike him in the middle of crossing the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, despite a lifetime spent commuting across it. To this day, he finds himself unable to cross the bridge without the fuzzy promise of terror taking root behind his eyes. He hires the same driver each time and counts him as a personal friend. They exchange emails and Christmas cards. He and this man who keeps his fear at arm's length, held stably in a 10-2 position on the steering wheel. In 1967, the Silver Bridge, taking Route 35 across the Ohio River to join Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and Gallipolis, Ohio, collapsed under the weight of rush hour traffic. The disaster resulted in the deaths of 46 people, 2 of whom were never found. One survivor recalled seeing the bridge begin to quiver as he and his wife crossed it in their car. She turned to him and asked, "What will we do if this thing breaks?" And the next thing he knew, he was breaking a window in order to escape. His wife did not survive. Later analysis of the wreckage revealed that the bridge's collapse was due to a single fractured link in the bridge's suspension chain. The defect was 0.1 inches deep and would have been invisible to inspectors. As the West Virginia Historical Society quarterly notes, the bridge's collapse could not have been foreseen with the technology available at the time. The town of Point Pleasant is supposedly haunted by a large winged humanoid creature called the Mothman, whose sightings are said to portend catastrophes. In 1975, the author John Keel released a book of theories and research linking the collapse of the Silver Bridge to various Mothman sightings in the area. Fascinatingly, thousands of miles away, UFOologists in Russia also claim that sightings of Mothman preceded a series of apartment bombings in Moscow in 1999.
On a nameless arc of coastline, old and young stood. The day before, waves came over the barrier stones and dredged up lost things from the depths. In the morning, thousands of objects lay half buried in the grit. Tiny fragments of fading color, frayed strands of tousled filament, translucent membranes which blew across the tidal flats at the slightest breeze. The rest defied ordering, explosions of texture and markings, spiraling ridges in irregular curves, the remnants of those who came before. Old closed their eyes and listened. The crunch of Young's bare feet on the silt, the distant groans of the barrier stones, the low rumble of the ocean, all almost metronomic, a long, melancholy, withdrawing breath, the inhalation of the world itself. At the edge of the shore, Old felt like they were standing on the threshold of everything. Old opened their eyes. Young stood not far off, examining a corroded piece of flotsam, a circular husk shaped like a sea pod and rimmed with sand. Young prodded the object with a piece of driftwood, and the body split open on an unseen latch. Inside, under a stratum of splintered glass, 2 faces peered back at Old and Young. The washed-out image showed the wear of the tides, the features of those pictured worn smooth. Ink ran down their cheeks in blue rivulets. their colorless eyes revealing nothing, expressions forever lost to time. Young reached for the object, but Old guided them away. Sometimes Old wept. Memories bobbed to the surface. Flashes of bodies plunging to the earth, the tangles of limbs, the eyes seared shut, the swollen tongues, the swarms of black flies. Old remembered a sickness, the silent fear lingering between each frantic and labored breath, the red of popping eyes and straining necks, the blood splattering bits of phlegm. The ash raged through the streets and alleyways in suffocating thunderheads of smoke. Gray powder speckled the blank faces of its parents, still wrapped in each other's arms. Some nights, Young would wake and wipe the tears from Old's wrinkled face, not understanding. Old had never seen Young cry. Like Old, Young never spoke. Yet sometimes in the stillness of the night, Old caught Young making sounds, mimicking the song of waves against the coast, wind through the reeds, or rain upon the sea. Perfect impressions, a dead language that all others had forgotten. Some nights, Old thought they could hear the world whisper back. Old came into the world. Young was of the world, was the world, and the world was Young.
Malcolm shifted towards the middle of the canoe, his body long and spread out, feet hung over one side, elbows propped up on the other, neck stretched back, eyes closed to the soft, humid sky. Patches of tightly wound hair grew down his neck and up his cheeks. Sweat crept through his undershirt, and Jay snatched whiffs of him, rank and rusted, rippling off the wind. They kept to the middle of the river, the banks far to each side. He couldn't swim to either shore even if he wanted to, but Malcolm could, maybe effortlessly so. Jay imagined him floating face up, sun blazing off his chest and toes, a rough laughter falling distant as the current pulled him south towards the Atlantic. All the large houses on the river at twilight, with lights in the windows like beacons, and the families inside. They'd see him floating down the river and take him in like some stray that needed saving, or they let him pass until he was out of sight, until he vanished, like Manny. The breeze sent goosebumps scuttling down Jay's arms. He watched the cloud as it passed between him and the sun. Did you check the weather? His dad said he hadn't. The weatherman had been recycling the same script for weeks now. Every day was hot. Every day, rain fell elsewhere. Should we head back? I haven't caught anything, said Malcolm. They worked their way downstream. The river narrowed. Water was breaking white over brown stones in the shallows ahead. You could just let me out there if you want. I can find my way back. Malcolm pulled a can from the cooler. You know, he said, me and your Uncle Alan built this boat. I was younger than you. We scrapped together what we could during the week and spent it all at the sawmill. Everything we're sitting on now. We had to stencil the pieces and cut them out with your grandpa's jigsaw, sand all the wood down, bend the cedar into place, glue it, then sand it down again. All spring and summer. Sometimes it was like we were working in circles, wrapping up one thing, then turning around to finish the next. I'd comb my hair and there'd be sawdust in it, like powdered sugar. My palms stained and varnished. I loved the smell. I'd spend all day breathing in my hands, telling Mama I was praying. When we were done, I half expected to go back to the beginning, to start all over. The boat was beautiful, and I was scared to take it out. But Alan said he would whether I was coming or not. We pushed out the boat, the same place we did today. Imagine being out here and all you can smell is the sawdust and the varnish under your nails instead of the river and the black mud on the shore. He brought some bait and it was squirming in the can, eating up the dirt. I think he taught himself how to fish. When? I don't know. I had no idea what to do on the water, let alone find whatever swam in it. I was amazed that the river wasn't seeping in through the hull, catching my toes, that we could be carried on something we'd made. I didn't want to learn how to fish. I could watch him all morning on the river. That was all I needed for that day and the ones that followed. And it was enough to be out there by myself when Alan moved away and left the boat here. It doesn't feel like enough, Jay said, to be out here not doing anything. Malcolm sipped from his can. One time I was on the river with your mom. There's a spot about 30 miles south where it opens wide as a lake. A green shoal sits in the center, all the water cutting around it. It was the first time I ever took the canoe out with someone else, without Alan. Me and your mom didn't know the shoal was there, so finding it, I don't know, felt like we discovered it first. Malcolm drank a little more and flicked the rim of his can several times, a sharp, hollow beat under his story. We hadn't gone looking. Jay had, though, but he hadn't found Manny, only dusted off memories and anecdotes. What do you think would happen? That he'd come across his friend, face down on the cold, smooth stones, and the clear water running over his hair? Or see him flash behind coarse brush on a shoal in an old story? No, he's seen what happened, seen him vanish, seen a baseball fall through where he'd just been standing, thump down on the thin footprints in the hard sand. You think they'll find him? He said. People came and went and came back again. Up until now, they'd always come back. Who? Manny? Said Malcolm. If they want to, or I suppose, if he wants to. Maybe we can head down there. We could look for him on that island. We're not going to find him there. You don't even want to look. You can be upset, Malcolm said. It's fine. It's normal. But you can't make something happen just because you want it to be real. I bet you wish you were him, Jay said. I bet you wish you could disappear. Malcolm flicked his can a few more times. Where would I go? I like it here. I grew up here. I got what I need.
The conversation was cut short by a rap at the door. Kaminer looked at Lathe and Absatz with a dinner plate eye, put a finger to his lips, and then jumped up and ran to the door. The young man who loomed into the room was wickedly slender, as if he had been drawn by a pen with a viciously fine point. He looked around the room with a twitching motion, manted. There was a nearly imperceptible rasp to the way he pronounced the letter S, so that it glinted out from his speech like a knife in a moonlit alley. His face was a blade that stabbed forward. Kaminer took his cloak and led him to the table, where the young man introduced himself simply as Caltrop. Caltrop settled down into a chair. Kaminer fetched him a drink, while Absatz introduced himself, and Lathe warily followed suit. When Kaminer returned, he asked Caltrop about the honeymoon with his niece. We went south, like the birds, Caltrop explained. It's famous down there for, the beaches. But I must say, I was struck most of all by the local gastronomic culture. The what? The cuisine, Caltrop shot back at Absatz. Kaminer also didn't follow. Well, what's wrong with it? They all foodophages down there? Caltrop was becoming exasperated with the interruptions, his face reddening and his voice rising. Nothing was wrong with it. If you people would let me, speak, you'd have heard all about it already. And? Probed Absatz. And it was good. Jesus Christ, I was excited to tell you about it, and now I'm all, worked up. Kaminer crooned soothingly to his guest, and stood to refill the glasses. Perhaps out of pity, Absatz inquired further about the southern gastronomical culture, with more sympathy in his voice. Lathe followed Kaminer from the table, and asked if there might be anything for him to nibble on. Kaminer offered him a pair of bread ends, which Lathe accepted greedily. When Kaminer had refilled the glasses, they returned to the table together. Absatz had begun to shuffle a deck of cards. Caltrop was saying, and I've always preferred the, riper cuts, somebody that had lived a good long life and got all those tasty minerals into their meat. But I swear to God, if they didn't make the best roast I've ever had while we were down there. And do you know how old it had been? 4. All of 4 years old. Not even bloomed, forget ripe. And so now here I am, having a crisis, because maybe I would like the young meat better, and I've been missing out this whole time. Kaminer set the glasses on the table and lowered himself heavily into his chair. Been saying that for years, he said. How many times have I gone through all the trouble of getting an actual flank? I'm talking about one person's, not that general ground stuff where they mix everybody all together. I get a real flank only to have the missus come down on my head, screeching about how young meat doesn't sit right in your stomach. Eat me instead if you care that much. But you know what? She eats every bite, every time. Lade's appetite had vanished once the talk of meat began. The bread end sat in his lap, forgotten. He pictured the toddler roast Caltrop had described, but chased the image away, part revolted, part scared that his appetite might return. Personally, as an Epicurean, Absatz was saying, I strive for the golden mean. 25 to 28, he brought the 3 fingers of his right hand to his lips and smacked a kiss, is simply the tastiest period of any person's life. Not too young, not too old. It's the best of both worlds. Kaminer and Caltrop nodded sagely as they considered what had been said. Then, as if suddenly remembering something, Caltrop looked up, turned to Lade, and his eyes seemed to take on a cold, sinister edge. Lade's stomach turned as Caltrop asked him, "And you?" Lade fumbled for a response, said he really liked it all, and smiled weakly, but the blood pounded in his ears like cannon fire. The room started to spin in 2 directions at once. Caltrop was not satisfied and pressed for more. Kaminer joined the cause. "Come on, surely you must have a favorite." Lade stammered something unintelligible. The walls tiptoed inwards. His mouth was dry. He felt like he was drowning. Why won't they let up? Why do they want to know so bad?
Water. Picture me standing on a dock on a river. The wood is dirty with sediment because the river has recently flooded. Now the water flows calmly, ripples, shines in the sunlight. A small flock of geese float with the current. Trees lean over the banks, their branches swaying in a light breeze, their green leaves reflected on the brown water. The things below the surface of the river are hardly visible. Memories like the water, slippery and distorted, not to be trusted. All that we are. I am looking at the water, leaned against the railing, head bent down. I am looking back 10, 15, 20 years, always looking back. My fondest memory as a child takes place on a warm summer night. It is late and the sun has just gone down, the smallest strip of light peeking out at the world's edge, just beyond the trees behind our house. I am lying in my mother's bed, the ceiling light bright on her purple walls, and the fan on the lowest setting so that the air feels like a soft, cool breath on the hairs of my arms. I am still at the age where I take baths, and I am freshly bathed. The window is open. Outside, the crickets and frogs are singing in the ponds. I can hear my mother in the bathroom, helping my little sister. At this young age, I am selfish, absorbed in myself. At this age, I do not exist as a person yet. I am in the family, the most I will ever be for the rest of my life. I only know myself as I know them. I only exist in them. My grandparents bought the house in Spotsylvania in the 1980s. 1 story, 4 bedrooms, and dark bevel siding on 2 lots, so that the backyard extended all the way to the next street over. I asked my grandfather once why their backyard was so big. He told me it was because he didn't want someone else's house to be behind his, so they had a huge backyard with its own decaying asphalt driveway. My sister and I were endlessly fascinated by the knots in the trees, the moss that took up more of the yard than the grass, the little stream of water that ran through the ditch. We made mud soup in the side of a tree, dumping in dirt and leaves where the rainwater collected in a hollowed-out knot, and stirring it with a stick. We built fairy houses, out of twigs and mats of moss, with leaves for carpets and flowers for beds. The split-rail fence gave us splinters, and we would hang off of it, rocking the posts back and forth. The house was always full of people, our family friends and my grandparents' neighbors, and us, my mother and father, the 2 daughters, my 2 aunts and their children who came a little later. We were there every weekend at least, running around the kitchen table in circles and out into the garage, out to the cul-de-sac and then back into the kitchen and out the sliding glass doors to the backyard. My grandmother's corgis chased after us, trying to herd, nipping at our ankles when they got close enough. My mother and grandmother made us meals together while we sat at the kitchen table. My mother told my grandmother that she needed to clean out her fridge more often, told us never to eat anything from the fridge unless she had checked the date on it first. I think the oldest thing she ever pulled out of the fridge was a forgotten tub of sour cream that had gone bad over 2 years before. In the kitchen, they made potato salad with mustard, and my grandmother told us how she used to eat raw potatoes like they were apples when she was growing up. My mother told us how her mother saved money by buying powdered milk and rubber-like cheese when she was a kid. I still remember the little red reflectors staked into the grounds at the end of my grandparents' driveway so that no one would back themselves into the ditch in the dark. One night, my grandmother called our house and asked to speak to me. I was 5, or maybe 6. I held the cordless house phone and looked out the window as she told me to. I could not imagine her then, was not interested in imagining her then in that moment. I must imagine her now, standing by the glass sliding door in her kitchen, looking out into her own backyard with her phone in her hand and twisting the white curling cord. Looking out like I was, in my inside-out pajamas. It was snowing, white flakes illuminated in the yellow porch light, already starting to stick to the grass and brighten up the dark world. I prayed to Mother Nature to make it snow for you. I asked her if we were allowed to pray to Mother Nature, if that was okay with God. My grandmother told me God isn't everything, so Mother Nature is God. My grandmother knew God in a secret way, in a way that the pastors and reverends didn't. To me, she had full authority on all things holy. The snow was holy, the world was holy. Flushing ice cubes down the toilet and wearing pajamas inside out was as much talking to God as praying was holy. When I look at the water in the river, I feel some strange witchcraft in the world, a terrifying calmness, an overwhelming beauty. I have the unshakable feeling that this is all happening again. Each second feels impossibly far from the one that precedes it. Still, I'm living it again. I'm there again, once more 5 years old. It is not survivable. In the water, you are drowning, begging for dry land.
I'm Nate, and I'll be reading a bit from my thesis titled Mothers and Heresy. Father Steele was large, and every part of him was square. He donned wide, square lips, thick, square brows, and a pink, square nose. His hands were like unsculpted blocks of clay. I considered his fingers' ability to bend at all, much less handle the wafers and wineglass stems of his communion rituals without disintegrating them in his grip, nothing short of miraculous. To receive the bread was like prying the body of Christ from a boxing glove. I'd endured one of his handshakes before. His hands felt surprisingly soft, yet the force of his clenched mitt was unrelenting, as if someone had the courtesy to put pillows around your hands before crushing them in a vice. His belly was enormous but firm, and as square as his hands. He did not jiggle. He was packed hard like the plowed snowbanks lining the December sidewalks. The eggshell robes he wore, trimmed in gold, suited his massiveness. He looked like a king, I always thought. The billowing fabric concealed his bulk so that I never thought of him as obese, just large. The only hint to his fatness was his neck, a bulbous collar of paunch from which his booming voice emanated. A bullfrog with that wide chin and mouth, the pouch below them contracting and inflating as he spoke and sang. It looked as though his clerical collar cut into the bottom of it. It must have. The commencement of each of his sentences rang like the sound of a cannon, except drawn out. His volume never wavered. If anything, it grew. He filled rooms. Despite his thunderousness in sound and stature, his was a comforting presence. It had to do, I think, with his Boston accent. It said, "I'm one of you." He sounded like the locals at Maddie's sail loft or the fishermen down at the wharf who let the children watch as they gutted and cleaned their fish. "I'm just a guy," said his accent. "Just a guy who happens to be a priest." He was kind and good, especially with us children. His booming church voice softened when speaking with us. Occasionally he would visit us at religious ed, and we greeted him as a celebrity. My parents hid it better than us fidgeting children, but church was a bore to us all. Our family attended church only on Christmas and Easter. We knew him, he was a hard figure to forget, but he never really knew us. Regardless, we were grateful for Father Steele's unmistakableness. It carried us through our biannual masses. I can only imagine what he looked like to my mother when he lumbered out into the ice and cold to get into her Toyota minivan on that night. In 2011, it still snowed on Christmas. The winters of my childhood teemed with snow. There were blizzards and whiteouts and nor'easters. School was canceled from snow falling high enough to block the doors. We could climb up snowbanks onto roofs and sled off of them. Our little fingers and ears froze and glistened red. It occurs to me now, due perhaps to climate change or the cynical realism of adult memory or a combination of the two, that it has not snowed on Christmas in many years. It seems that snow does not arrive in Massachusetts until January, February. The Decembers feel like Novembers used to. Gray, wet, icy, dirty. Not that night. That night it snowed. Proper snow. Heavy, fluffy. The skies dropped down the kind that could blanket streets within the hour. The kind of snow that I brag to my southern friends I can drive through with no problems. A northern snow, a Christmas snow. A peaceful snow in which to die. On the phone with hospice, my mother told them that my grandmother needed her last rites. Mom told them it was important to her mother that the priest be Catholic. That'll be easy to find on Christmas Eve, the hospice person joked to her, the first moment of levity that night. Hospice told my mother that the priest on call was none other than Father Steele himself, who could bless my grandmother between his evening mass and his midnight mass around 9 p.m. I never considered before this conversation with my mother that there were people on call to bless the dying. I wonder how often those phones rang. Over the phone, Father Steele told my mother, "I don't have a car." He pronounced it car, wonderfully Bostonian. "You're going to have to pick me up," he said. Thank you very much.
Hey guys, I'm Elliot. Banoy. This is my thesis, the first part of my thesis. It is called Daughterly Progress in Writing. It is a memoir-based piece. Here we go. When I was a girl, I used to sit and fill my eye sockets with my knees. The first time I can remember folding into this position felt as though I had discovered a way to return to a place I had come from before, though this place felt not physical, but like a secret power. It was a lingering consciousness that could be reached only through the portals the pressure of my knees created. The spots and the kaleidoscopes did not appear until I pressed so hard that I became dizzy, and it was through concentrating on these wiggling worms in the darkness of my meeting skin that I was able to relieve whatever sadness brought me to this position with the private knowledge that I alone went to this arena of magic. Momentarily, I was not Elliot, this girl so stuck on the plane of sisterhood and daughterhood. For how could I be from the same plane as my brother, who did not agree that there was something to be learned from our knees, who said so in a way that brought me right back down to the eye socket knee kiss? How could I tell my parents that their movements worried me, and that the way they spoke to each other left me scared and tearful, not because I knew that our family was in the process of collapsing, if we ever were a structure to collapse, but because I had no way to communicate such knowledge to them. I did not know how to warn them, to suggest that I could see something that they could not. I was captured with this duty, and I had no way to save them. I only knew how to mourn what was never in our family. I didn't tell many about my magic, as I feared solitude and my specialness as much as I relished it. It was my mom I told of these channels behind my eyes, on the wall-to-wall, blue shag carpet, in my parents' room at our first house. She possessed a whimsical kind of adoration for me that transcended motherhood, and landed on a plane that was for just me and her, and all the versions of us we had been before, a horse and a devout rider in one, 2 soldiers from the Polish countryside in another, daughter and mother in this one, where she was given to me for both of our sakes, sent as I had been in all of our versions, a remedy for what she hadn't been given. So when I told her that my knees filled my eye sockets like a puzzle piece, and not just this, but this was the purpose of knees, to squeeze eyes onto until the sadness was minimized by the dark container of inquiry, she was my remedy too. I have come to believe through writing, as I have come to believe most things. The memories I did retain knew they had to stick around because there was something to be learned from their loud, sticky presence. I am trying this thing where I personify my memories as being little puppy helpers, biting first, but when trained can kiss and slobber, bring a garden glove with an expression that is nothing less than a smile. And though I am angry at the memory puppy for chewing that garden glove at first, I give in. I pull on it and run with it. There are memories here that are not puppyish, no matter the way I twist it. They have taken me to the darkest of knee-eye kisses, and to write them is to have these little puppy helpers devour a day and a night with their destructive immersions, as if not yet potty trained, there's so much shit. Yet still I must feed them and listen when they whine.
Hi, I'm Lyla Ward, and I'm reading an excerpt from my thesis, which is currently untitled still. This section is called The Kiss, and it happens when the main character, little Camille, and her friend Magdalene are on a retreat with their Catholic girls' school. It was not wonderful. It was a lot of teeth for Magdalene. It wasn't red like her dreams. It was blue, almost sort of gray. It was almost like being bored. It wasn't being bad like being sexy. It was hiding like having to pee. Like everyone gave up looking. Little Camille felt like it was happening to her. She wasn't out of body, she was in there. Like cameras in the eyes of a mannequin. Like water in a glass, still water somewhere where the earth has no tremors. The couch they were on was just like the ones they had back at school. Waxy wood benches with cushions weft of evergreen plastic, wrapped tight to busting around yellow foam rectangles. They kissed for maybe 10 minutes, only kissed. One of little Camille's hands was on the back of Magdalene's neck, the other on the place where Magdalene's shoulder met her neck, the tendons underneath hard at work, keeping her mouth moving against little Camille's. For one moment, it was wonderful. Magdalene came so close to little Camille so that their chests were pressed so hard together and their stomachs beat against each other with their hearts. And it felt like being together, like making a body out of two bodies, like making life. And then Magdalene's throat made a gasping, sucking sound, and the room rebuilt itself around them. Cushions filling once again with the yellow foam, and the clock back at its ticking, and the sickly wooden stairs waiting to creak, maybe even creaking. And little Camille pulled away. Magdalene's face looked like a feverish toddler's. Nothing was as sacred as promised. They said a few words to each other. Okay, sorry. We should probably go back to bed. Yes, good night. And they did. Magdalene went first, leaving little Camille alone in the dark common room, across from the windows. She noticed the moon shining naked in the sky, close to the earth. The room felt like a cavern. She felt like a creature. The dark wooden ceiling slanted above her head. She was in the darkest corner of the large room. On the table next to her was a box of sari, beaten blanket soft with use. If she was looking at a picture of herself on the couch, the screen door, the wood everywhere, the alcove of the stairs where it twisted towards the left, it would look like a nightmare. Horror movie, Green Lake, bad man, bind, torture, kill, but she felt nothing creeping in the corners. Only herself. Felt no fear, only the silence and the saliva drying on her lip. She was in a different world with different demons.
I'm David Willis, and this is a reading from my 2021 thesis, a story called In Goldenrod and Break. It's about a man called the Wanderer who lives in a van on an abandoned farm in North Carolina in 2047. It's a story of love and loss and the end of the world. Barth said somewhere that no exegesis on love is without address. This is no different. 7. The sun was in its usual place, high in the sky. a position it now occupied with what felt like a dogged ferocity. The shower bag warmed quickly, but I washed myself uncomfortably. I could not stop thinking of urine. When I was cleaned, and my hands still somewhat damp, I laid my palms against a dry patch of earth and rubbed the dirt that clung there onto my forehead and across my cheeks, brushed a dark streak across my left forearm. 8. There were certain questions that living in a van solved merely by the fact of living in a van. One of these was a question of privacy, something once considered in apartments and open blinds. The resolution to this prudish notion was twofold. First, the van had not much space, and certainly not enough height in which to stand upright, so changing oneself mostly happened by necessity outside, rooting around in bags with the back doors swung wide, and revealing the softness of one's pale belly to an audience of no one. There was an early temptation to dress oneself quickly, hopping barefoot in a rush along the gravel, trying to put one's foot in the leg of a pair of pants. But when I realized I had nothing to worry about, no voyeurs save insects too absorbed in their own business, I put on clothes with leisure. Nakedness became a thing of which not to be afraid. The more pressing question was what it is to be wanted, though this question predated my arrival on the farm, and I imagined it would follow me were I ever to leave. Living in a van, sensitized to one's own excretions in the way only produced by ritually burying them so that each would become memorialized as the mounds multiplied, erased the practicality of the question. There was no one else around to do the wanting, or else nothing about my new life, of which there was particularly much worthwhile to appraise and then choose to want. Provided then by this life a freedom from such a stereotypical concern, I should have contented myself to living much out of doors in the sun and wind, and with that certain roughness of character, not returned to ideas of Nicole. But I did. I suppose then that these thoughts are somewhat asked for, existing as I did alone and on the outskirts, the conditions such thoughts must consider ideal habitat, the uninterrupted, reclusive mind. I relished these thoughts, not so much because I could heal by parsing through them, which was not the original intention of this state of mind, or even a secondary one, but because I could enter a kind of trance where my solitary being, unbothered by the advice of friends or the misdirection of love's portrayal on TV and in books, could see things clearly for what they were, and feel in that moment of searing clarity a visceral, physical reaction of standing outside oneself, beyond language and cliché. For instance, the term most of my generation would have used to describe the pattern of wanting between Nicole and me was on and off. When considering the reality of our relationship, however, I began to realize that such a description, evocative of a toggling switch, of a ceiling lamp strobing above an indecisive finger, was inadequate. It seemed unfair to compare the energy of Nicole's satisfaction with me to a binary that could only ever exist as one of two states. More accurately, I came to understand her attraction to me more as something akin to a solar eclipse, affected by some cosmic circumstance neither of us fully apprehended, and which was occluded sliver by sliver until one was thrown into darkness. This change could be noticed if one looked closely enough, but most people aren't aware of the timeline of total eclipses, rare as they are, and only through searching my memory can I remember those markers of passion decreasing, almost imperceptibly, until they were gone, cast into shadow with only the blind sensation of something dreadful occurring. I would go through the motions of our relationship with the faith that eventually her feelings would return. And every time they did. But as with the days blinking that follows the return of the sun, I saw Nicole with confusion. Was she still the same, or had something been swapped? Had the world rearranged itself in the darkness when I could not have noticed its familiarities being replaced with uncanny, unknowable copies? 9. The sound of water traveling up from its underground well and through the pipes of the old hand pump, vibrating so strongly that even in its concrete mooring small flakes of rust would fall from its outer layer and drift towards the ground, always put me in mind of something slithering inside a wall, and recalled something of living in an apartment, where bumps and knocks and the whoosh of fluids traveling somewhere out of sight alerted one to the recognition they lived in a box, engineered for the convenience of a maximum amount of people. Though I am glad to have left such a lifestyle behind, and doubt that I can find a better isolation than the kind I have discovered here, I paused cranking the green handle earlier than I normally do today, to better focus on the sound of liquid rising, and wonder if in the dark wet of that aquifer so many feet below me, there was an isolation more perfect. Thank you.